historicity of the saying of Jesus in John. He will look at all the options available, and then he will choose, infallibly, always, without exception, the most conservative view available.
كن سعيدا كن فريدا عش بفخر في الحياة لا تبالي فالمعالي بالتحدي لا سواه كن سعيدا كن فريدا.
In the scenario you gave, I also mentioned earlier that occurs in a time period that Mark's gospel simply doesn't cover. Mark hasn't chosen to admit that particular thing. He's chosen not to mention the childhood or pre-birth of Christ. So there's no opportunity for Mark even to mention that, even if he chose to do so. So I don't think that well, he could have chosen to, he's not omitting that for the sake of his view on Mary. He's omitting the pre-birth narrative for some reason that we could dispute.
The entire life of Mary in Luke's Gospel, she is portrayed as a positive role model. Okay. He knows how Mark talks about it, and he chooses to admit or delete that story because it doesn't accord with his view of Mary.
That's fine. They do have different views of Mary. I accepted that. I'm just saying with the Magnificat specifically.
Well, which is history.
Okay, just saying. Really to summarise, because it was just a challenge, the Magnificat specifically, the way Mark has structured his Gospel, there is not a place that he would put that in. Now, in terms of which is history, this is a really good question. I take quite a conservative view of the Synoptic Gospels, such that I think they record what was actually said and what was actually done. But how do you accord for the differences amongst them? As I've been saying, I do think they're different perspectives, different theologies. They bring out different elements, but I don't think they're diametrically opposed to one another. If I'm talking about my friend John, if I'm trying to stress the sinfulness of man, I can point out all the flaws, all the weaknesses, all the failings of John. If I'm trying to point out in my narrative the beauty of Christian friendship, for example, a very different purpose, I will highlight all the good ways that he's been a blessing in my life. Likewise with Mary. As mentioned earlier, Mark has an overall narrative which is stressing the lack of faith and the weakness of those from whom we most expect it. So I would say I take a historical view of what's going on, but yes, I do think when we're approaching the Gospels, and actually Paul would agree with me here, they're not pure, simple histories. They're not just trying to say what happened, though I do think at least the synoptics are trying to do that. They are crafting a narrative to make a point. That's why they are very selective about what they include, and therefore you will come away with very different impressions based upon that agenda. Did I answer your question? Or?
Not really. I disagree with everything you said.
You're welcome to disagree. Did I try and answer your question, or did I miss your question?
No, I think the Magnificat issue is, I think you misunderstood my point, which is that from the beginning of Luke's Gospel, from the Magnificat onwards, you have a very beautiful portrayal of Mary in Luke as a believer. It's irrelevant that Mark doesn't have a Magnificat. I'm saying that from the beginning of his story, Mary is a disbeliever. And I was just pointing out, doing redaction criticism, observing what was going on. So I think they are fundamentally incompatible portraits, and we don't know on the basis of the Bible, which is true. We have to go outside of that if we can. But the broader picture is that Mark has fashioned his material to present an overwhelmingly negative view of the disciples. The later Gospels correct and embellish their own stories to present a much more positive view of the disciples. As historians ask what really happened. They have to choose between or go to a third option about what happened. Yeah. And that's the problem. But we also see this, we also see the problem here of the status of Jesus, where Jesus in the earliest Gospel does not walk around saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life, before Abraham was I am. He is not presented as a pre-existent divine son, whereas in John he is. And scholars overwhelmingly have had to choose in history which Gospel is more likely to be the historical Jesus, either Mark or John, to give the two ends of the spectrum. And 99% of scholars in history for the last 100 years, at Oxford, Cambridge, Yale, Harvard, you know, they've chosen Mark over John. And John is the later, highly interpreted account where words are put in the mouth of Jesus. To use Richard Baucom's language, this is your own scholar here, he uses this language of John putting in the words of John putting in the mouth of Jesus words like I am. And if you read his book, The Crucified God, by Richard Baucom, a lesser-known text, he constantly talks about where he uses Isaiah language and puts it on the lips of Jesus. And I agree with him, he does. So even the most conservative Christian scholars acknowledge that gospel writers make stuff up, put it on the mouths and the lips of Jesus, and then average, not you, but average Christians out there believe that Jesus actually said these words historically. But your own scholars freely acknowledge, even the Richard Balcombe, that this is not true. And it's this big gulf between what your scholars know and teach and what the people in the pew are not told. I don't imagine your church, I don't know your church, but what's the likelihood of them, in your church, you're being told what I've just said about your own scholars, about Richard Balcombe?
Yeah, pretty low.
Is it zero, perhaps?
To my knowledge, they never said what you just said.
Exactly.
And I'm on your side
and this is the scandal. You've got this sex scandal in Catholicism. This is the intellectual sin scandal of Christianity. Is that the priests and the pastors and ministers who get trained by these scholars at university, they do not pass on this information to the people in the pew. The people in the pew are not stupid. For example, this chap here, who I know, he has a PhD in mathematics. He actually does. I'm not making this up. But he is a typical guy in the pew who will not hear in his own church what I'm telling you, because the pastors and ministers do not teach highly intelligent people like this gentleman here, who could understand, because they got an IQ probably higher than the minister, if they were just told. The question is, why do not priests, ministers and pastors pass this information on?
They're not there to pass on that sort of information. Part of it, my primary purpose of a sermon is as a pastoral. It's pastoral in order to teach
you may be
your
right.
life.
You may be right.
And
They're not that
theologically about Christ. The average person in the pews is not after.
This is an average person in the pew with a PhD in mathematics. No, he's not stupid. I'm not being patronising. You're both bright people. You deserve to be told.
I understand he's not being patronising.
Trying not to be patronising. But my point is this, that I think you deserve, as a Christian, to be told the truth about the Bible, that your own pastors and preachers know from the Richard Balcombes and the Tom Wrights, the leading biblical scholars of the world. They do not pass this on, and that is a scandal, in my view.
Okay, even that view that these words are made up and not put in, and they didn't actually come out of the mouth of Jesus, yes. I still expect there's a spectrum amongst scholars, exactly what is true with respect to that point.
I'm quoting the most conservative Christian scholars that he recommends, and they say it too. I'm not quoting liberals or radicals.
There's a creative element.
There's a spectrum within that belief. My point was there's a spectrum within that belief. And which point on that spectrum are they meant to teach?
They don't teach any of it, but they don't teach any of it. They don't attempt. Well, I take your point about sermons perhaps not being the right place, but at least perhaps a minister could say, right, I'm going to hold a Bible class on a Wednesday evening to teach the truth to teach you what our own biblical scholars are saying about the Bible the last 100 years. What are the scholars saying about the Gospel of John? Is John's Jesus historical? Is he actually saying what the historical Jesus said?
As long as there are some scholars who are saying, sorry, I'll just take that from you, thank you. As long as there are some scholars who are saying it is historical, then presumably pastors might choose to prefer those ones and go with that narrative. So,
can you name me one who does?
So I'm trying. It's a while since I've read it, but a lot of work has been done on the historical reliability of John by, I think it's either Craig Blomberg or another kind of quite well-known, respected evangelical scholar. Basically, thinking. Acknowledging there are kind of prima facie some differences between them, but trying to account for that in many different ways. So I presume pastors might have read those works. I presume pastors might have read those works and found them convincing.
I think the problem with Craig Blomberg is, if people don't know who he is, Craig Blomberg is a New Testament scholar in the United States who teaches New Testament studies at Denver Seminary. To be on the faculty of Denver Seminary in the United States, you can go on the website, Google it, Denver Seminary. They have to swear and sign a document every year that they will teach about the Bible, that is the holy, literal truth, the historical, factual truth of God. And if they don't sign that, they don't get a job. They lose their tenure. So even though Craig Blomberg is actually a real scholar, and I have some of his books on John, and I respect him, he is constrained within a very narrow theological parameter that he must say at the end of the day that John is factual, John is true, because if he doesn't, he will lose his job. And that is one hell of a motivation for someone to say, his scholarship, unfortunately, in my view, operates within those parameters. And if you had a gun to your head saying you had a mortgage and kids, unless you say the right thing about the Bible, you will lose your job. What are the chances of you doing the right thing?
It depends how much personal integrity we think that Craig Blomberg has. I'll leave that to Craig Blomberg.
But this is a really important point. So coming back to him, he has what he does is his methodology is what I call maximally conservative. So he'll look at all the critical options about the historicity of the saying of Jesus in John. He will look at all the options available, and then he will choose infallibly, always, without exception, the most conservative view available. And then he will incorporate that. So you have a patchwork of scholarly views, but they're all the maximally conservative. Now, I will question that methodology.
But which comes first, the chicken or the egg?
The chicken. No.
Is he at Denver Theological Seminary because he is very conservative, sincerely believes that, thinks that's the best intellectual case, therefore ends up at a seminary where he has to believe that? Or does he have to believe that and that means he's always wedded to that?
Both. Both and.
Is there a pressure on him to always be conservative?
Yes.
Does that override his intellectual integrity? I don't know.
His methodology is one of maximal conservatism. Is that a scholarly critical methodology? To always choose the most conservative view?
If you believe that that's where the evidence leads, then yes. I don't know what's going on in his
mind.
Why
has he got this methodology? Because, partly because his seminary requires him to have that view, and it does require him.
But what I'm saying is, he had that methodology, and that's why he went to that seminary.
So this is why, or both, I think. This is why.
Who knows what's going on in the mind of Craig Blomberg?
No, but we do know what's going on in terms of the organisational constraints and what he's permitted to publish as a Denver Seminary scholar, and those are very narrowly defined.
But we don't know whether that has ever stopped him from coming to a different conclusion, or if he has intellectually always agreed with Denver Theological Seminary, which is quite possible if that's his epistemology, that's his methodology. I'm saying we just don't know. So you're right.
I think it's very questionable. So I think we need to look at other scholars who are not constrained by their employer to produce certain kinds of work.
There is another option open to him,
which
is if from particular verse, if he disagrees with the maximal conservative view, he could just not talk about that verse and go on to talk about another verse.
No, I agree. But he doesn't. He always chooses the most conservative option.
You don't know if he's not.
No, I do, because you can see it in the book. If you go through all the arguments, I can predict on any given discussion, he will always pick the most conservative view.
You don't know that he hasn't considered other verses for discussion in that book and then left them out because he doesn't
I'm going to leave
agree.
you to it. I've got a train to catch.
Have you?
I do actually. I've got a family dinner.
Okay, have a lovely time.
Sorry.
Lovely, as always.
Thank you.
And have a nice family dinner.